Last time, I talked about Pokémon Red and Blue's early game, from the start until the point players can capture their first wild Pokémon. This time, I'm gonna take a more general look at how Pokémon's gameplay works, starting with how every Pokémon is built by the game, followed by a breakdown of the battle system. First, I'd like to touch on an aspect that can be seen throughout all of the game's design. Pokémon games are designed to be playable by everyone, and I mean everyone. They should be interesting for veteran players, but they also should be fun and accessible for newcomers, especially younger newcomers. As I mentioned in the last video, this is why the starters are Fire, Water and Grass, because this is the easiest way to understand how the types work. This is also why the first dungeon area in the game has Pokémon that are bugs who evolve into cocoons and then into either a butterfly or a bee, because the metamorphosis of bugs is the closest real thing to Pokémon evolution. Keep this design philosophy in mind while I talk about the game's battle system. I'll start with how the game defines each Pokémon. Every Pokémon is actually different from almost every single other member of its own species. Here's an outline of how it works. Every Pokémon has the HP, Attack, Defense, Special and Speed stats. Every species has a base value for every stat. Every individual Pokémon has a value between 1 and 15 for each stat, that defines how good that individual monster is on each stat. Finally, each Pokémon gets an invisible experience for each stat depending on the defeated enemy, slowly increasing their power over a recently captured one of the same level and potential. Not only this serves to reinforce the concept of every Pokémon being a unique being, it also reinforces the idea of the player creating bonds with those Pokémon, as a trained one will almost always be stronger. This idea is a recurring theme throughout the games, with the villains, Team Rocket, being a group of people who use Pokémon as emotionless tools. Even if that wasn't the case, it's hard not to get attached to a creature you captured and raised it to a higher level. Later games added more mechanics to further increase this distinction, such as every Pokémon having a certain nature, which is basically a personality, that affects how its stats grow. Pokémon has a unique battle system that is much more complex than many of its contemporary RPGs, which hardly went beyond basic attacks and magic, but it's still simple enough to be operated by a child. Every Pokémon has 1 or 2 types out of a list of 12 that relate to each other in a rock paper scissors kind of way. Many times are neutral between each other though, lowering the mental load of remembering them all. Each type is also defined as either physical, such as normal, rock and fighting, or special, such as water, fire, or psychic. Physical stat interactions are governed by the attack and defense stats, while special stat interactions are governed by the single special stat. I'll get to that oddity in a moment. Most of the game's NPC trainers focus on only one Pokémon type. For them, this is clearly a terrible strategy, and it makes the experience intentionally easier, as the enemy's whole team shares at least one weakness. Of all 15 types though, 2 in particular stand out. The Dragon type is limited to a single evolution line, Dragonites, and it's used only by the second to last trainer in the game, Lance. It's clearly designed as a boss type, as it's specifically resistant to all 3 starter types. Dragonite itself is what's usually called a pseudo-legendary, a Pokémon with stats so high it reaches levels close to, or even higher, than the special legendary monsters. The Psychic type is one of the 2 biggest balancing mistakes, at least concerning multiplayer, in Generation 1. It's supposed to be weak to Bug, but the only decently damaging Bug move in the whole game is only learned by Beedrill, a weak Pokémon that's also part Poison, which makes it weak to Psychic. If the anime is to be believed, the Ghost type was supposed to be strong against Psychic, but that's only the case in later games, and all ghosts in this game are also part Poison type. Ghost 2 lacks strong moves. It's no wonder that the game's strongest Pokémon, Mewtwo, is a Psychic type. It's also no wonder the second generation games introduced not one but two types which are resistant to and or strong against Psychic, Dark and Steel. On the topic of moves, or lack of moves, each Pokémon can learn up to 4 different moves, and most moves fall on 3 categories: damaging moves, moves that increase the user's stats, and moves that decrease the enemy's stats. Limiting it to 4 moves could very well be due to memory limitations, but it does work to keep any individual Pokémon from being too versatile, forcing the player to use the 6 slots in their party to full effect. And speaking of party slots, 6 is a strange number, but it allows players to have a pretty decent type coverage while still forcing them to think about what they're taking. With 15 types, even if it was possible to have 6 Pokémon with 2 exclusive types, it's impossible to have all of them in a team. Every damaging move also has a power and accuracy value. Those values are never explicitly mentioned in Gen 1, which I assume was probably to keep it simple. Differently from later generations, Pokémon here usually don't learn many moves that aren't always better than the ones which they learned before. In fact, Pokémon barely learn any moves in Generation 1. Compare what Charmander learns in Pokémon Red to what it learns in Pokémon X for the 3DS, for example. It should be noted that series director and producer Junichi Masuda has mentioned in interviews that it was considered, when the series was making the jump to the GBA, to increase the number of attacks Pokémon could learn to 5. But the idea was rejected precisely because of balancing issues. The 7th generation games, to be released next November, found a middle ground on the so-called Z moves, which consist of a 5th powerful move that can be used only once per battle. Pokémon types affect battles both offensively and defensively. For example, a fire attack does double damage on a grass-type Pokémon and quadruple damage on a grass-bug Pokémon. If said fire attack is used by a fire type, however, it receives an additional same type attack bonus, or stab for short, of 50%. This is done to make it worth the player's time to train and use different Pokémons, instead of just throwing a bunch of different elemental moves on a single one. There is, however, one notable Pokémon that completely breaks this attempt at balancing: Chancey. Chancey has a very unique stat distribution: extremely high health, coupled with low physical defenses and a high special stat. Ideally, Chancey is a powerful wall against strong special attackers, such as the Psychic type. The problem comes from the fact all special stat interactions are governed by the single special stat. Which means that while Chancey has a very high special defense, it also has an equally high attack. Couple that with the fact that it can learn powerful special-based moves such as Thunderbolt and Ice Beam, and many Generation 1 multiplayer battles devolve into who can kill the other's Chancey first. Even without Chancey's high HP, Pokémon with a high special stat are generally overpowered in Generation 1, with the aforementioned Mewtwo and its massive special stat of 154 being almost invincible if it uses Amnesia, a move which doubles the user's special stat for the battle. Naturally, starting from Gold and Silver, the special stat was split between special attack and special defense. I cannot imagine a design reason as for why it was a single stat in the first place. Considering how much Red and Blue pushed the Game Boy's memory to its limits, I tend to guess it was a way to save a little space on each Pokémon. Another possibility is that the physical stats were originally thought of as the Pokémon's strength and endurance, while the special stat was a more general spiritual strength or energy, as seen in the Psychic type. Regardless of the reason, this was the first of many major changes the underlying systems for Pokémon battles saw during their many revisions. One factor that makes Pokémon's battle system simpler and more predictable is the fact that every battle is one-on-one. This is very different from, for example, a Final Fantasy game where all of your party battles the whole enemy group at once. This way, the player doesn't have to mentally juggle too many type combinations and options, which could be overwhelming for some players. Of course, a battle between more than one Pokémon on each side does bring increased strategic depth alongside the increased complexity, and that is exactly why, starting from Ruby and Sapphire, this became an option. In fact, the Pokémon game's World Championship is played in doubles mode, also because of this reason, but the games themselves mostly keep to the one-on-one style. There is one big advantage the game gives players when battling NPC trainers. By default, after defeating one of the enemy's Pokémon, the game says what Pokémon is coming next, giving players a free chance to switch in someone who will be at an advantage. Normally, as seen in multiplayer fights, the next Pokémon would simply come out, and switching your own Pokémon would mean the new arrival would have to take one attack. This slight cheating in favor of the player makes the game monumentally easier, as the enemies can be always at a disadvantage. In the options menu, this can be toggled on or off, but it remains the default option in every Pokémon game to date. And while you're in the subject of simplicity, there's probably no easier way of playing Pokémon than playing the whole game with just your starter. And that's what we're gonna be talking about next time. Thank you for watching this to the end. I'll try to get those videos out every week, so keep a lookout. Thanks again, bye.